It really is an honor for me to be here speaking to you all and engaging in discussion with the next generation of leaders of the security sector in Africa. I very much appreciate the invitation from the Africa Center for Strategic Studies and the opportunity to be here. As Joe mentioned in his comments, I am not primarily a practitioner. I've never led soldiers or police or run a defense ministry. I am, though, an analyst at RAND, where we have worked very closely with the U.S. Department of Defense, trying to understand what works and what doesn't in various aspects of U.S. security policy. Along those lines, I'd like to frame my comments this morning around three sets of questions that we've looked at RAND that provide a little bit of background about what the United States is hoping to achieve in security sector assistance and how we think that we might be able to make this work better in the future. In particular, the first question, why does the United States provide security sector assistance? Secondly, what evidence do we have, if any, that it works? And third, what might you all, as emerging leaders, do to work with the United States so that U.S. security sector assistance is more effective in Africa? Mr. Samukai, no doubt, will have better answers on that last question than I do, as someone who has worked very hard to make U.S. security sector assistance work in his country, but I can at least share a few of my thoughts. So the first question, what is the rationale for U.S. security sector assistance? And what are the linkages between this assistance and U.S. national interests? I should first start by just defining terms very briefly. When I use the term security sector assistance, this is official U.S. government terminology. It means security assistance, or simply the provision of aid, advice, training, equipment, and so on. It also includes security cooperation, either military to military engagement, where high-level U.S. military commanders will meet with their counterparts in African countries. It also includes things like exercises between U.S. units and African units. And finally, it includes security force assistance, that is much more intensive work with a partner, as we saw in Afghanistan or Iraq, but also in Liberia and other contexts. So why is it that the United States provides security sector assistance? What is it that the United States itself hopes to achieve for U.S. national interests? There are a couple of internal objectives that the United States is pursuing whenever it provides this sort of assistance. The first simply is relationship building. The United States wants to establish strong relationships with the countries of Africa. During peacetime, it wants to be able to have those relationships to maintain good ties. And during times of crisis, it wants to know who it needs to call, who it needs to communicate with, and how things work in partner countries so that it can make things move quickly if it needs to. For instance, if there's a humanitarian emergency, it is important that they know who they need to call in a particular country in order to provide food or other sorts of humanitarian assistance and get it on the ground as quickly as possible. The second reason the United States provides this sort of assistance is familiarization. The U.S. military operates in contexts all around the world. Many U.S. military soldiers, at least the younger ones, have not lived outside of the United States before. So when they engage in exercises or military-to-military engagements with their partners in Africa or elsewhere, they're learning how to work with other militaries, how other militaries operate. They're learning how to communicate with their colleagues. And they're learning how to operate in a huge variety of physical contexts, from jungles to desert, mountains, everything else. So these are two of the inward-looking reasons that the United States provides security sector assistance. Obviously, though, the United States also has external goals, things that it hopes to accomplish out in the world. In the African context, it will come as no surprise that one of those goals is countering terrorism. This does not mean necessarily destroying all terrorist organizations. The United States has a focus on terrorist organizations that pose large-scale transnational threats across borders. The hope is that by providing security sector assistance, in some cases that the United States can degrade terrorist organizations. In other cases, the hope is simply that we can deter terrorist organizations. That is, that they find that our security partners in Africa are sufficiently capable that violence is not the best way for them to achieve their goals, and hopefully they look to engage in the political process or other means besides terrorism. The United States also has an interest in countering large-scale transnational criminal activity, whether that be piracy or illicit trafficking. It has an interest in enabling economic relations. When security sectors function well, are able to provide for security and the rule of law, it facilitates cross-border trade. And finally, the United States has broader interests in stabilizing partner governments. For instance, there is a strong link between civil wars, other forms of mass violence, and epidemics like Ebola. To the extent that US security sector assistance helps to stabilize governments, provide them the opportunities to build their own capabilities for a variety of things, like responding to outbreaks of disease, then that helps the United States by limiting a variety of other sorts of security risks other than violence. Now, obviously, there are some things that have changed under the Trump administration, and I think there are many people around the world who have some concerns about whether US foreign and security policy is going to look much different in the future than it has in the past. I think there are at least 2 points of emphasis with the Trump administration that are important when thinking about future security sector assistance with the continent of Africa. The first point is an emphasis on self-reliance. This came out very strongly in the remarks of National Security Advisor John Bolton in his December speech at the Heritage Foundation, in which he emphasized that the United States wants to help partner nations become self-reliant and believes, at least in part, that the way to do this is through capitalism, growing economies, and trade or commerce that benefits all parties. The second emphasis is on accountability. And here I'd like to quote from the December speech from John Bolton, who said that the United States will no longer provide indiscriminate assistance across the entire continent without focus or prioritization. And we will no longer support unproductive, unsuccessful, and unaccountable UN peacekeeping missions. He went on to say, assistance should decline to countries and organizations making poor policy choices. In addition, we should target resources toward areas where we have the most impact to ensure efficient use of taxpayer dollars. These were some of the themes that came up repeatedly in the National Security Advisor's speech. One of the things I think, though, that is striking is that in many ways, these are not a radical change from prior administrations. I think there has been a growing sense in previous administrations that much US security sector assistance has not been particularly productive, and there's been an emphasis on trying to find ways to get it to work better. At RAND, we have seen this with our studies and analysis. We have very frequently been receiving calls from staff members at Congress, from various parts of the executive branch, asking what evidence do we have that security sector assistance works, under what conditions, for what purposes. So I think this is a broader concern in the US foreign policy establishment. It is not simply something that is going to be an emphasis of this administration. A second aspect of continuity under this administration that is perhaps surprising to some was the emphasis on governance. Bolton, in his speech in December, never mentioned the words democracy or good governance. But a lot of those themes were very clearly in his speech. He said, for instance, countries that receive US assistance must invest in health and education, encourage accountable and transparent governance, support fiscal transparency, and promote the rule of law. The administration will not allow hard-earned taxpayer dollars to fund corrupt autocrats who use the money to fill their coffers at the expense of their people or commit gross human rights abuses. Again, this, I think, is an aspect of continuity. The United States wants to have very wide, broad-based partnerships throughout Africa, but it also strongly believes that those partnerships are at their strongest when the United States is working with partners who govern themselves well, who look out for their people through a variety of investments in public health and education, but also in responsive, accountable security sectors. Again, I think this is a point of continuity. If there is a greater emphasis on accountability now in US security sector assistance and making sure that we can see some sort of results, then what evidence do we have that it works? Under what contexts? I mentioned before that a number of organizations have come to RAND asking us if we have any of this sort of evidence. We actually conducted a study for the Office of African Affairs at the Pentagon on precisely this question. If you look at a lot of previous studies, there are a lot of case studies and lessons learned about particular cases of security sector assistance in Africa. And while their findings vary depending on the context and what it was exactly that the United States and its partners were trying to achieve, I think there is considerable evidence that the United States and countries like the United States can help partner nations develop their tactical level military capabilities, at least with select units and at least in the short term. We've seen a variety of engagements in Mali, in Somalia, and other contexts where partner units who had worked most closely with US military forces or French military forces, other partner nations, did very well in a lot of these military clashes in these contexts. So I think we have a fairly strong anecdotal, but multiple anecdotes of success with this sort of goal. The evidence, though, becomes a lot murkier, a lot less clear when you move from those pretty narrow goals towards thinking about success, not just for particular units, but for entire armies or entire security sectors. And when you think not just about tactical military capabilities, but about achieving the strategic impact that you want. And when you think not just about short-term engagements, but about the long term, the ability of US partners to sustain the improvements that they get through US security sector assistance, and to use those improved capabilities for purposes that actually work towards the national interests of their country, towards the interests of their people. Here again, the evidence is much murkier. And this is where we conducted research. We were not trying to find particular examples of success stories or failures. What we were looking for was broad patterns of success and failure. So we conducted a statistical analysis of all of the independent countries of Africa for several decades. What we did was to look for flows of US security sector assistance, where you see an increase in this assistance for a period of time. And then we would look over the next decade at types of violence and levels of violence. Did you see a decline in the incidence of civil wars and insurgencies? Did you see a decline in terrorism? And did you see a decline in violence by state security services, that is, by gross violations of human rights? We conducted this analysis, again, over the course of several decades, and we found three main findings. The first had to do with the Cold War period. In the Cold War period, we actually found some evidence that US security sector assistance was counterproductive. At the time, the United States did not emphasize governance concerns when it provided assistance. In a number of cases, it provided assistance to highly corrupt, autocratic governments that did not serve their people. And unsurprisingly, a lot of subpopulations then would reach out to the Soviets, the Cubans, or others to get the means necessary to resist their governments. And so in some cases, we saw this spiral during the Cold War, where US security sector assistance actually led to more violence, more civil wars. In the post-Cold War era, things shifted. The United States started emphasizing governance much more in its security sector assistance. It tended to provide assistance to two types of countries in Africa, either countries that were relatively well governed or countries that were affected by conflict or had recently recovered from conflict and were trying to stabilize themselves. In this period, we found, in general, no evidence either way that US security sector assistance on the whole, across all of Africa and all of these countries, had any aggregate effect, positive or negative. Now, that doesn't mean that no US security sector assistance had any impact. It could be that less costly forms of assistance, things like this seminar here today, things like advising missions to help people with their ministries of defense, training. All of these are relatively more inexpensive forms of assistance. The really expensive forms of assistance tend to be the provision of material support, weapons systems, vehicles, that sort of thing, equipment. That's much more expensive. So it could be that some of these cheaper programs were effective, but when they were combined with equipment, the huge amount of money that we spent on equipment was largely wasted. But we found one other finding that I think gives us hope, and I think gives us a way to think about security sector assistance moving forward. When US security sector assistance was provided in conjunction with a UN peacekeeping operation, we found repeated evidence that it had positive effects for the recipient country. They were less likely to experience civil wars or insurgencies, they were less likely to experience terrorism, and they were less likely to experience human rights abuses by their security forces. And this was an effect independent of the effect of the peacekeepers who were present. Now, there are a lot of reasons why this could be, but from case studies, we have at least a few hints about why we might have seen this relationship. When you have a UN peacekeeping operation present, you have a variety of personnel who are there, international personnel who are there on the ground for the long term. And so you have a lot more interactions. It's not simply a particular exercise that happens and then no other contact for a year. It's not simply a bunch of equipment that's dropped off and then no one knows what happens to it. Instead, it's intensive, repeated engagements where the international community provides assistance and then they get feedback. Is it working? Is it not? What do we need to change to make this work? Under those contexts, there's evidence that US security sector assistance can help. It can have longer term strategic impact. So I think moving forward, our recommendations at RAND, and this is something I've seen more broadly in the US defense and foreign policy community, is an emphasis towards trying to think about how do you develop these longer term, more intensive partnerships where security assistance is not provided just to get short-term tactical successes, but is instead part of a longer-term strategic relationship trying to achieve strategic impact. I'll conclude just with a couple of comments. Again, I think my fellow panelists will have more insights into what you all, as future leaders of your country's security sectors, can do to try to make security sector assistance work better in the future. But I'll offer just a couple of thoughts. The first has to do with sustainability. There is an enormous emphasis, especially from the United States Congress, to see if the capabilities, the improvements that you see in the short term from US security sector assistance are sustained. This means thinking about what is it going to take to make sure that whatever assistance the US provides is still going to have meaningful effects 5 years, 10 years down the line. This could be inventory management systems. It could be train-the-trainer approaches to making sure that whatever training the United States provides then is passed on to other units that were not taking part in a given activity or exercise. But in any case, making sure that the systems, the processes, the institutions are in place to sustain whatever benefits US security sector assistance has. I think in some cases, this may mean institutional reforms, that is, building the institutional capacity of ministries of defense, of their organizations, like, for instance, the equivalent of the US Training and Doctrine Command in the US Army, which is all about making sure that whatever lessons soldiers got when they were deployed to Iraq, Afghanistan, or elsewhere are then internalized, that when they go out and do exercises in the Baltics, in Europe, that people then back at home learn those lessons, even people who are never out in those contexts. So building those sorts of institutions, I think, is something that I've seen an increasing emphasis on within the US Department of Defense and the Department of State. And finally, evaluations. As I mentioned before, I think there's a growing call for rigorous evaluations. And so thinking about how do we communicate to the United States what it is that you all want to achieve, how it is that African partners can agree with the United States on what are their priorities, what are the things that they most want to accomplish, and then working with the United States to make sure that the United States is actually helping to support those objectives, but also putting in place evaluation systems so that we know 5 years later, 10 years later, have we been hitting the mark? Have we been improving those capabilities that you want to see improved? If not, then I think both the US partner countries and the United States can agree we need to do something else. We're not meeting your goals, and we're not meeting the United States' goals. So I think an emphasis on evaluations on shared objectives that both parties can commit to will be increasingly important moving forward. Thank you very much.